If you haven't already done so, you can download the latest version of the Unreal Development Kit at www.udk.com. This is also a really good place to get advanced documentation on the tools. You can see the Unreal Development Network, which is a great reference site for any of the features of the editor, and then a couple other resources as well. So downloading and installing the UDK is really easy. I won't walk you through that. Once it's installed, go to Start, Programs, Unreal Development Kit. There will be a folder based on the version you've downloaded, and then a link to the editor right here. So click that, and we're off. When you first load the editor, you should see something that looks about like this. There's a tip of the day window, which actually has really good information, and I recommend you go through it at your own pace. But for right now, I'm going to close it out. And there's a start page, which you might notice there's a whole bunch of different tabs at the top here, and we'll get into more detail on that later. So I'm going to close that to get it out of the way as well. And then what you're left with is the main map editing window. Not too interesting without a map loaded though, so let's load one up. Gonna go to File, Open. Now by default it should load into the Maps folder if this is a fresh install, but if it doesn't, you can browse to the folder here. Whatever your install folder was defaults to C:UDK. There'll be a folder for whatever build number you have, and then it's under UTGame, Content, Maps. And for starters, let's load up this map here, DM Sanctuary. And I'm going to resize the viewport just a little bit. Now for this DVD, I recommend as much as possible try to follow along. If you can, pause the DVD, load up the editor yourself, try out the things that I'm showing you. A lot of these tools, the best way to learn it is just to develop the muscle memory. So if it's possible, try to follow along as much as you can. So I guess the first thing we need to do is learn how to navigate around the world. So let's look at some of the camera controls. They're a little bit different than you'd find in another 3D package. And they may seem counterintuitive at first, but once you get the hang of it, it's really well suited for navigating a 3D game environment. So first, the most easy to explain is the right mouse button. If you click and drag in a 3D viewport, it sort of rotates the camera around the current position. Doesn't move anywhere, but it allows you to get a good view of the world around you. So give that a try. Now if you click and drag with the left mouse button, if you move it sideways, it's kind of the same. It rotates around the current position, but if you move forwards and backwards, you'll notice it moves you through the world. But it doesn't move it forwards in camera space, it keeps you at the same elevation, which is really useful for editing a 3D game because most of the gameplay tends to happen on a flat plane. Well, more or less. But this allows you to get in, start placing gameplay objects like these, for instance. But basically you can zoom around in the world with the camera facing down to where you need to be set dressing without constantly moving forward into the geometry as you drag the mouse button forwards. So again, like I said, muscle memory is everything, so if you can practice that a little bit now, please do so. Now the next most important control is if you hold both the left and the right mouse buttons at the same time, that allows you to move either up and down or left and right, depending on which way you drag the mouse. So by using all three of those controls together, left mouse button, right mouse button, and both mouse buttons, you can move through the world really quickly. So just to demonstrate, I'm clicking and dragging with the left mouse button here, making my way around the perimeter. I come to a staircase, so I'll hold both buttons and jot up a little bit. Moving down and to the right by using both mouse buttons, I get inside. I'm sort of free look with the right mouse button, look around, and then I can continue to move through the space. So again, like I said, really fast controls for moving through a 3D world once you get the hang of it, but you are going to have to build up that muscle memory. Now, one other note about camera controls. You'll notice every viewport has the same set of buttons above the top of it. One of them is this one here. It's sort of a box with a blue line at the bottom. That's your camera movement speed control. If you click on it, you'll notice the blue line moves so that it's halfway full, and the camera will move a little bit faster. Click on it again, camera moves faster still. So that can be really good if you're working in a large map, or if you're just trying to get a sort of overview of the space, and you don't need to do any detailed work. You can move it into fast mode and get around much more quickly. Now, moving into 2D views, once you get the hang of the 3D view, the 2D view should be really easy. Left-click drag pans the view around. Right-click drag actually does exactly the same thing. And then if you hold both mouse buttons, that'll zoom you in or out. Now, one final note about camera controls, for now anyway. You can use the middle mouse button, the scroll wheel to zoom in and out, and that will move you forwards in camera space. I recommend against it. It may feel more natural at the beginning, but it's kind of a crutch. It's nowhere near as fast as using the controls that I just described for getting around. So if you have to use it just to get up to speed, do so, but just remember in the long run, if you can learn these other controls, you'll be much better off and you'll be much faster. So let's take a look at some of the different types of objects that make up the game world. Obviously there's a lot of textured geometry here, and that's going to show up pretty much as is once you load up the game. But there are lots of different kinds of gameplay objects in the editor viewport too. You've probably already noticed all these little Apple icons floating around, for instance, or these wireframe boxes that seem to be all over in the world. Let's go through one by one, sort of turn them off so that you can see what they actually are. So you'll notice every viewport has this little, in the top left corner, it has this little black downward facing triangle, which is the show options. And if you click on show, this is a list of all the different types of things that you can view in the viewport. Anything with the check mark obviously is turned on right now. So first let's turn off all of these wireframe boxes. Most of those, at least the pink ones, are blocking volumes, which is something that the player, it's sort of invisible geometry that the player is going to collide with as they move through the world. But there's different types of volumes too. We'll get into that in a later chapter. So I'm going to do show, and then I can click on volumes. Or I could hit the hotkey O to turn it off. So I turned it off, or I can press O to toggle it on and off again. Alright, so now let's look at some of this world geometry and see what makes up the world. The first thing, if you click around a little bit, as you select stuff, you may notice that lots of these objects are fairly detailed, fairly high polygon, and those are what make up the bulk of the world. Those are called static meshes. Most of them were modeled in a 3D package like 3ds Max or Maya or XSI. So let's hide those actually so that we can see what's left over once those are gone. So I can go to show and then static meshes, or the hotkey is W. So what we have left, you'll notice there's a lot of sort of really polygonal geometry. And what that is called BSP. And that's geometry that you can actually build inside of Unreal, inside of the editor. Now if I toggle static meshes on, you can see it makes up maybe a third of the surface area of the level, maybe a little bit less than that. But it's a really important tool, especially in the early prototyping phases, when you want to just really quickly block out the level, see how it's built up without having to put a lot of detail in. But even for a finished level, like the surface of the ground here is made out of BSP geometry, just because it's hard to make static meshes. You don't want to have to make a custom static mesh for every wall and every floor that doesn't conform to one of these detail pieces. So with that, I'll hide static meshes again, and then let's hide the BSP, and the hotkey for that is Q. And now what we have left is terrain. You can see it's sort of this undulating surface. It's got a height map painted in it, so it moves up and down. And then it also can do a texture blend. You can see here we're blending between this sort of rock texture on the right-hand side and this sort of pinkish dirt texture on the left-hand side. And this is a really critical tool, especially for any sort of natural environments. So let's hide that. Show terrain, or the hotkey is T. And now we've pretty much clobbered all of the visible geometry in the world. And now all that's left is gameplay objects. So let's turn those back on. Now, you may have noticed static meshes, or W, is if you've used a 3D program like Max or Maya, that's a really common hotkey. That's one of your transform gizmos. So it's really easy to accidentally turn stuff off by hitting one of these hotkeys, and then get confused and not know where it went. I know I've fallen prey to that many times. So a really handy trick just to set everything back to default. Hit your viewport options, go to Show, and then the very top option, Use Defaults. That turns everything back on, including those volumes. But we got all our static meshes, BSP terrain back, basically everything. So if you're ever stuck, if you ever can't find something or something's not working properly or you just don't know what's going on, that's a good first thing to try. Show, use defaults. And I'm going to turn volumes back off again. Now, one other really cool trick. Say you want to see what the scene looks like without all of the gameplay objects in it. You just want to preview what it's going to look like. Say you're just worried about the artwork. Well, what you can do is press this button here, this sort of pixelated G, and that goes into game view, which, like I said, literally hides everything, all the gameplay stuff except for the visible geometry. And this even shows you like post-process, like as I move inside, everything gets a little bit brighter and a little bit warmer colored. So this is the best way pretty much to preview what the artwork is going to look like. And there's a hotkey for that too, which, if you hadn't guessed it, is the letter G. So that's a really easy thing to toggle on and off. Now, let's look at what some of these gameplay objects are. The best way to tell, in case you forget, if you select something, at the very bottom of the window, you'll see a little string of text here. It's a little, may seem a little like gobbledygook at first, but pretty much everything will start with the word persistent level, which is just sort of shorthand for, it means your map. And then it'll give you a clue as to what it is. So this is a path node. So this is sort of what allows bots to make their way through the world in an intelligent way without just sort of stumbling around blindly. Let's see if we can find some other object types. All right, so you may have noticed these little joystick icons. If I select that, I can tell that that's a player start. So when the player spawns, he's going to randomly choose between one of these player starts. And let's see, I think we've got some light bulbs around here. Those are light sources, as you'd probably guess. There's these little icons that are, okay, those are a little farther away, but these little 5 colored dots, those are emitters, which is another word for particle system. So anyway, basically anything that's in the world, if you need to figure out what it is, you can click on it and you'll see at the bottom of the window. This is an ambient sound, but that's a really good and easy way to tell what something is. So enough about what's in the world. Let's look at how to actually modify it. If I select an object, you'll notice that there's a little transform gizmo at the bottom. And if you've used another 3D package before, this will look really familiar. But this is our move widget. This allows us, well, to move the object around. If I click and drag on one of these handles, I can move it forward and backwards, left and right, or up and down. Oops. And if I click and drag on sort of the intersection of these two, this little box here, I can move it in 2 dimensions at the same time. That may be a little hard to get the hang of in the 3D viewport, but it works really well in the 2D views. I guess a couple notes about working back and forth between the 3D and the 2D views. You'll probably notice if I click on one of the 2D viewports, it'll select whatever object I clicked on, and if I click back in 3D, it'll select that object. So the way you can preserve your selection when changing viewports is when you click in a different viewport, just click and drag slightly. What that'll do is it'll tell Unreal that basically you wanted to just move the camera a little bit rather than actually selecting an object, and so that way you won't change your selection. So you'll probably notice, or you may have noticed already, every time I click in a new viewport, I just drag it ever so slightly. One other note, if I move the object in the 2D view here, it doesn't update in the 3D view until I let go of the mouse button. Now, the way you can get that to update more directly is in the 3D view, click on this button here, real time. It's like a little joystick icon. That will also turn on any particle systems or audio or any animating. So things will run a lot slower when you're in real-time mode, but if you just need to see something update live while you're working in a 2D view, that's the way you can do it. So anyway, that's how you move an object. To rotate an object, you can see up at the very top of the viewport, here are all your different widget types. So I'm going to change to rotation mode, and it works pretty similarly to moving. Click on one of the circles, and it rotates the object in that dimension. And then I can go to the scale tool, and I could scale it. Pretty straightforward. I can also, the hotkey for that is spacebar. That'll toggle between the three different widgets: move, rotate, scale. So again, once you get the hang of it, that's a really easy way to get back and forth between them. Now, one other option you have in Unreal is you can transform objects either in world space, which is what we've been doing so far, or in local space. So notice I've got this column tilted off to the side, but if I want to move it, I still move it up and down. Well, what I can do is go to the top of the window here. You can see there's a little drop down that says World, and I can change to Local. And now my Move widget got reoriented so that the Z-axis points along the direction of the object. So now I can really easily move it in the direction that it's oriented locally. And the hotkey to toggle between those is the tilde key. That's usually the one in the top left corner of your keyboard right underneath the escape key. So just be aware of that. Try it both ways. Both of them definitely have their uses. You just have to know what you need for the task at hand. Now there's one other transform widget, which is non-uniform scale. You can't get to it by using the spacebar hotkey, but it's at the top of the viewport right next to the word world. If I click on that, what I can do is click and drag any one of the handles, so you can see I'm making the column shorter, but the radius stays the same. Or I can squash it in one dimension, or I can squash it in the other dimension. So that can be really useful. If you stretch things too far, you start to notice like the dimensions just don't look right, and if you get close, the texture can tend to look really squashed. But it can be really good if you just need to stretch it a little bit to fit into a different space or something like that. Also, one final note on that. When you go into non-uniform scale mode, it automatically locks it to local mode. You can't non-uniform scale in world mode. And if you get back out of non-uniform scale, it stays in local mode. So just keep that in mind. If you're in world mode and you're moving stuff around, and then you go to non-uniform scale, and then you go back to move, it's still going to be in local mode. There's one place where we'll get hung up with that later on. Normally it's not a big deal, but I'll bring it up again where it will become a problem. So now that you know how to transform an object around in the world, let's look at how to duplicate it. A couple ways to do it. First, and probably the easiest, is through the hotkey, which is Control W, or you can go to the Edit menu and then duplicate. If I hit Control W, it'll clone the object and it'll offset it by a little bit, just so that you don't accidentally end up with two copies of the object sitting on top of each other. So I can duplicate, move, pretty easy. The other way is if you hold the Alt key, you can then click and drag on one of the handles on the Move tool, and that will automatically give you a copy of it. Really easy, really straightforward. Both of those are valid. I use both of them. It just really depends on the situation. But give them both a try and make sure you know how to use them. So you may have noticed by this point, when you move objects around, they tend to jump a little bit. Like if I drag this pillar, you can see it tends to pop a little bit. It jumps a little bit when I move it. And that's because we've got grid snapping turned on. You can see all the snapping controls in the bottom right-hand corner here. And the leftmost one, the one with the little grid icon, is for the Move tool. So you can see I'm snapping to every 16 units. If I hit this little drop down and change to a smaller number, so say 1, it's got a lot smoother movement. Or I can uncheck the check mark and turn off snapping altogether. So let me set that back to default, 16 units, and I'll show you why snapping can be a really good thing. So say we got the staircase here. It's made out of lots of individual staircase meshes. If I clone one of these over, let me get it off to the side here. Say I want to put two of these side by side. If I have snapping, these objects are built to a certain set of dimensions so that they work really well in the grid. And you can see, if I get close, these two meshes just line up perfectly. There's no obvious seam between them, well, maybe a tiny little bit, but there's no gap and there's no overlapping. They just work really well together. And that's because I had the grid snap turned on. If I didn't have it on, if I uncheck it, and then I try to line these up, I've got to be really noodly and specific, and I either end up with a little bit of a gap, and then I got to get in and try to close it, but then they're overlapping slightly. Anyway, it's just really hard to do. So moral of the story is, for anything like these objects that are built to a certain length, grid snapping can be your best friend when it comes to lining them up. But that's not true for all objects. For instance, we've got these weeds here. These don't need to align to anything. I mean, they're sinking slightly into the ground and they're at a weird angle. So grid snapping doesn't matter at all for these. So really, it's just a tool to use wherever you need it. Anytime you got something architectural that's built to specific lengths, it can be really good. Anytime you've got something more organic, it's probably not necessary. So that said, that's the move tool snapping controls. We've also got snapping controls for rotate and for scale. So for instance, on one of these planters here, these two meshes, this sort of 90-degree quarter of a circle mesh, probably is the exact same mesh, just cloned over and rotated. So that could be really easy to do if I bring up the rotate tool. So right now I'm snapping to about 6 degrees. If I change that to 45 degrees, you can tell it sort of pops, well, 45-degree increments, which means it can be really easy to align. Let's see. It can be really easy to align two of these. Whereas again, if I didn't have grid snapping, that would be almost impossible. Or at least it would take a really long time. Now, you could set it to 90 degrees, but the controls feel just a little bit weird. You've got to drag the mouse so far in order to get it to actually rotate. 45 for me is usually the best. So usually I'll do 45, or like with the weeds, you may just turn it off altogether. And then same thing with the scale tool. Scaling doesn't really work that well with the concept of a grid. So in most cases, I just turn off snapping on the scale altogether, but I'll leave that up to you. So now I've got really smooth control. If I turn it back on, it tends to pop a little bit. Where that can be useful is if you're playing with it and you need to get it back to the original size, but yeah, it's just not as important as the move or the rotate. Oh, one final note on snapping. You can change the scale of the grid either by using the drop-down menu here, or you can just use the bracket keys on the keyboard. The right bracket will make the grid larger, as you can see in the 2D views, and the left bracket will make the grid smaller. So at this point, we've covered pretty much all of the fundamental tools of the editor. You know how to move the camera, you know how to transform objects, how to duplicate them, and the basics of the snap settings. So at this point, I recommend getting a little bit of practice. These tools are really the foundation of everything else we're going to do, so building up some muscle memory at this point will make things a lot easier going forward. So what I recommend is building a small little scene based on objects that you can find in the level. Maybe build something like those planters that we were looking at earlier, or if you look inside, there's a fountain in here. Take an idea like that, something not too complicated, maybe a dozen meshes or so, making it up. Grab stuff that you can find laying around and piece something together of your own. Again, it's all about the muscle memory, and once you've got that, everything else will be easy. So once you've got the hang of all that, there's a couple additional features that can speed you up a lot, but make sure you've practiced what I've taught you first so that this doesn't get confusing. Actually, a simple one first. say I've got an object selected in one of the viewports. I can easily center all the other views on it by pressing the Home key on the keyboard. You can see all 4 views snap directly to this object. Simple as that. That can be a really easy way either to get your 2D views to snap to your 3D view, or vice versa. Say I've got one of these meshes selected in a 2D view, that'll warp the 3D view there. So, simple as that. Next, there's a handy shortcut for dropping objects down to the ground. Let me find a good example mesh. All right, so say I take this railing piece and I clone it over. I can press the End key to drop it down to the ground. Now you'll have to be careful with that. Most objects it does a pretty good job, but occasionally, depending on the object or depending what you're dropping it on, sometimes it'll be floating slightly off the ground. This is actually a pretty extreme example, but always make sure End key will get it into the ballpark, but you'll usually have to do some fine tuning to make sure that it is resting properly on the surface that you dropped it down to. All right, next I'll show you sort of a shortcut to using the widgets. Now, again, this is kind of more of an advanced feature, but it will speed you up a lot. So if you've got the hang of the widgets and you want to give this a try now, awesome. Otherwise, maybe come back to it later. But what you can do, rather than having to pick and drag on the widget, it can be a lot faster if you just hold the Control key, and then you can click and drag anywhere within the viewport. So I can have my mouse in the top left corner, hold Control, and left-click drag to move the object, right-click drag to move it along the y-axis, or hold both mouse buttons and click drag to move it up and down. In the perspective view, it can be sometimes difficult to figure out which axis it's going to move it on, but the 2D views, this is great. Left-click drag will just move it around no matter where you've got the mouse. Now, in the 2D views, if you right-click drag, that'll rotate the object. Again, this works really well when you double it with the real-time viewport. It can be a really quick and easy way to position and orient an object. In the perspective view, if I change to rotate tool, I can control drag to rotate it around the z-axis. And then if I change to the scale tool, I can control drag to scale it up and down. So pretty powerful. It'll save you a quarter of a second with every mouse click, which doesn't seem like a lot, but that does add up if you're pretty heavy into working. It'll definitely add up over time. All right, now, say you want to select more than one object at a time. A couple of ways to do this. It's actually pretty standard across all software. If I hold the Control key and start clicking on more than one object, I add those objects to my selection set. And then I can hold Control and click on the same object again and again to add it or remove it from my selection set. So nothing too crazy there. And then of course I can move or rotate or scale all of those objects together once I've got them selected. Now another shortcut is I can do a drag selection. Now this only works in the 2D views, and it can get a little confusing just due to how much stuff is in the world. But if I hold both Control and Alt, and then left-click drag, and let me deselect first. Oh, another good shortcut, pressing the Escape key will deselect anything you have selected. All right, so if I hold Control and Alt, and then left-click drag, I'll drag a selection box. And now I've selected this whole sort of planter thing. But you can see I've also selected all of these other objects which were around it. So I can hold Control and Alt and then right-click drag to make a deselection box. So that'll deselect anything that I covered. So now I've got just this little planter selected. So we'll use that tool a little bit more later, but yeah, just know that it's there. Now, one last feature is one more camera control that you can use. So up to this point, we've been using left mouse button, right mouse button, and both mouse buttons, but there's a completely different navigation system, which is much more similar to how you actually navigate in a real video game, where you use the WSAD keys to move forward, backwards, left, and right. So the way this works is if you hold down the right mouse button, which puts you in free look mode, as long as the right mouse button is down, you can use WSAD to move forward, backwards, left, and right. Um, Now the trick with this is, if you remember, the W key turns off static meshes. So it's really easy to accidentally press the button in the wrong order or something like that and hide all of your meshes. And it can get a little bit confusing. It's hard to know where they went sometimes. So just be aware of that if you do decide to use this control. And you can always use the display settings and then use defaults if you do lose your meshes. But like I said, WSAD to move around, Q and E to move down and up, and then you can use the mouse wheel to control the speed of your camera movement. So I've moved the mouse wheel all the way down, so I'm moving slow, and now I'm using the mouse wheel to speed up. Like I said, give it a try. This can actually be probably the best way to navigate around a large environment quickly. Like if I need to get to the other side of this cathedral, I can do that, and then I can go back to the regular mouse controls for most of my object placement work. Again, another tool, don't let it confuse you if you're having trouble with the basics, but it can be really powerful once you know your way around. There are a couple of viewport controls I'd like to show you at this point too. Every viewport at the top right-hand corner has this icon, Maximize Viewport. And that does pretty much exactly what you would expect it would do. It makes it take up the full screen, which if you're primarily working in the 3D view, that can make things a lot easier to use. You can also, probably don't need this right now, but you can also change the configuration. If you eventually find that you're not using both the front and the side view, you can go to the View menu, and then Viewport Configuration, and then you've got different options for how to split up the view. So for instance, I can do a 1:2 split. This is especially useful if you've got two monitors and you can stretch the window so that the 2D views are on your second monitor. But this way, you get a bigger 3D view and then you can control exactly what you want in the 2D views. So I'll reset that back to default. One other thing, depending on what you're working on, in the bottom right-hand corner of the window, next to the snapping controls, is the control for autosave. I've got it turned off right now just because I'm demonstrating in a level that I don't plan on actually working in, so you may want to do the same thing. But as you begin working in your own maps, make sure you have it turned on, and then you can change the frequency of the save interval by clicking on the arrow next to it. And there's lots of other little details like that about the interface, and if you mouse over some of the icons, it'll give you a tooltip explaining what it is. Most of them will be pretty obvious from the tooltip, but more or less going forward, I'm just going to bring up these controls as they become important as we're using them in the workflow. But at any time, feel free to look around and see what you can find and see what seems useful to you. So at this point, we've covered a lot of the tools for working within the map, but what we haven't discussed is where did these objects come from in the first place. If you're creating a map from scratch and you want to place a pillar, well, you're not going to duplicate one. You're going to need to find it and place a new unique instance of it. And where all these assets live is in packages. Now let me explain the difference. So this is the maps folder that we've been looking in so far, and here's the DM Sanctuary map. The map contains a lot of like the position information for where this particular column is, its orientation. It contains all the gameplay data for these path nodes, all the lighting data, stuff like that. But it doesn't contain any of the raw assets, the mesh, the textures that make up this particular pillar or this wall or what have you. All of that stuff lives in packages. Now, all data in Unreal, at least all environment and world data, lives under this content folder. So we've got our maps here. There's a folder called environments, and this is where all of the packages live that contain all of the mesh data and all the textures. So for instance, we've got HU floors, which contains a bunch of stuff, a bunch of textures, a bunch of meshes that make up floors, or neck pillars. Neck stands for Necris, which is one of the sort of bad guy races in Unreal Tournament 3. So you can think of these as sort of zip files. It's a whole bunch of assets collected together inside of a single file. So let's look at how to actually get at these packages in the editor. Um, in the main editor interface, at the very top of the window, there's this icon here, Open the Content Browser. If I click on that, well, that brings up the content browser. And this is a quick and easy way to get at and to search any of those packages that we saw underneath the content folder. But before we go into too much detail on the interface, let me show you a quick and handy shortcut. If I go in the level and I select one of these pillars, I can right-click on it, and then one of the options at the top is Find in Content Browser. And what that'll do is it'll go find that exact mesh in whatever package it lives in. Now the list of packages is in the bottom left-hand corner of the window here. If I scroll up, you can see that this actually matches the folder structure that we looked at on disk. UT Game, Content, Environments. And then this is all of those environment packages we were looking at. And then this particular column lives in NEC pillars. And then the SM and materials and mesh, that's sort of grouping within the package, but you shouldn't need to worry about that right now. But long story short, this is where that pillar lives, and what's cool about that is now we can find all of its neighbors. The Epic artists organized this in such a way that all of the similar related assets live in the same package with it. So pretty much any of these pillars that we were to place in the level would look good next to each other. And a lot of them share the same textures too, so it actually saves a lot of memory if you can use assets from the same set. Let's look at one more example object. If I go to the edge of the map, there are sort of a bunch of rocks that make up the map boundary. I can right-click, find in Content Browser, or there's a shortcut for it, which is Control B, B for browser. And you can see that one lives in this package called UN Rock. And again, a lot of rocks in here, a lot of them probably share the same textures, and they all probably look good next to each other if you place them in the world. So what we can do is click on any of these packages and you can get a list of all of the assets that live in it. You can see at the top of the icon it says static mesh, so these are a bunch of archways. Up at the top these are materials. If I scroll down we can see some of the textures, and depending on the package that you select you'll see different types of objects. But static meshes are mostly what we're concerned with right now because those are the only thing we can place in the world. So if you want to browse this way, what we can do is filter so that we're only looking at static meshes. And that's this part of the interface at the top of the window here. The sort of second column over is object type, and one of the options is static meshes. If I click on that, now I'm only looking at the actual meshes that I can place in the world. But that said, this is where the content browser gets really powerful, is we can do a search. Say you just need a door, but you don't know exactly which package to look in yet. We can search anywhere in the content browser to find any meshes that match the keyword door. So what I'm going to do is, if I do a search, it'll search in whatever I have selected down in the package list. So I'm going to go all the way up to the top. I'm going to select just the top level folder content. And then up in the top right-hand corner of the content browser, I'm going to type the word door. And I still have my filter set to static meshes. So now pretty much what's showing up in the list here is any mesh that has the word door in its name, which at this point is maybe 24 assets, so that's pretty cool. And these are all different architectural styles. We've got these, if you mouse over it, you'll get a little bit more information. For instance, you can see it says path, and then we got NEC doors, so that's the package name. So this is like another Necris style mesh. These up here are more of an industrial or sort of sci-fi theme. Those are all under LT. So no matter what package these are in, you can quickly and easily find doors. Or I could probably find arch or rock. Anyway, really quick and easy to use. We can also narrow it down a little bit more. So for instance, I searched for rock, but we came up with rocket launcher, which isn't too useful. There's a tags list here in the column just to the right of object type, and this lets us narrow it down to a couple of user-specified tags. These are things that the artists at Epic have manually specified for these objects. So we can, if we just want to look at rocks, meaning outdoor environment rocks, well, there's a category for that. If I click that, then our rocket launcher disappears. So that can be another handy way either to narrow it down, or if you just want to look, like I can press this X to clear out that search field. Now I can just look for all building assets if I click on buildings, or I can look for deco, which is like details and stuff. And then you can do subfilters, decos that are also buildings, that sort of thing. Usually you'll get a lot of mileage out of the search tool, but this can help narrow it down too. So one last shortcut I want to show you. If you select an object after you've done a search, if you've got an object selected, you can right-click on it and choose the very top option, Find Package. And what that'll do is, in the packages list on the left-hand side, it'll actually go select the package and the group that that object is in. And so that's an easy way to find, maybe it's got some other neighboring assets, or if you just want to know what package it lives in, you can get at it that way. So let's go back up to the top. I'm going to search again for doors. Oh, also note that when I did the find package, it cleared out all my other search fields. So I'm going to recheck static meshes. And let's take this doorway prop. Now to place this in the level, sorry I don't have a lot of screen real estate here. If I want to place it in the level, I can just drag and drop this door directly into the scene, and it'll show up pretty much exactly where I placed it, where I let go of the mouse button. There's another slightly faster way to do it too. If I've got a mesh selected in the content browser, I can hold the S key and click on the ground. S short for static mesh. And that's a really common theme inside of Unreal, is holding a letter down and then clicking to be able to place that type of object. So we'll definitely see that again. But this is a really quick and easy way for me to place lots of copies of this door mesh, or if I want to find a second one, I can place it and then just do a little bit of noodling to get the alignment right. So that's probably the most common way to place objects in the scene rather than duplicating them, is just find it in the content browser, hold S, and then click to place it on the ground. So we'll spend some more time in the content browser later, but this should be enough to get you started finding assets, searching for them, and placing them in the world. So spend a little time with it. Like before, if you want to try to assemble a little scene, try to find some assets and piece something together, that would be really good practice. Otherwise, that's it for now. We'll move on to the next topic.